Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 6, Types of War, Revolutionary War, Civil War, Guerrilla War, Insurgency and Counterinsurgency, Proxy War and Asymmetrical War, and Terrorism. Here we are going to discuss Guerrilla War. Guerrilla operations do not necessarily have a revolutionary political aim, though their actions always contain a revolutionary potential. The US Army explains guerrilla war as combat operations conducted in enemy held territory by predominantly indigenous forces on military or paramilitary bases to reduce the combat effectiveness, industrial capacity, and morale of enemy. Guerrilla operations are conducted by relatively small groups employing offensive tactics. Guerrilla attack legitimate governmental and military targets. Guerrilla tactics consist of hit and run tactics, avoiding pitched battles, eluding the enemy pursuit by hiding in hills or forests or amongst the populace. These are simply tactics of conducting a revolutionary war. Guerrilla targets are military personnel or police rather than civilians. Guerrillas, by the nature of their offensive, must rely on significant popular support for their activities. Guerrillas employ mobility, elusiveness, and surprise to compensate for their weaknesses in men and equipment, and they usually comply with the recognized rules of warfare. By following those rules, they earn the right to be treated as soldiers, not criminals. Under the most recent internationally accepted version of rule of war, guerrillas must have a responsible commander who will answer for the conduct of subordinates. Operations must be carried out in ways that comply with others' customs and rules of warfare. Guerrillas hold on to little or no territory, attack when and where they consider the opposition weakest, and withdraw when the enemy gains strength, and derive the bulk of their support from the people of the area where they are operating, though there may be some outside help. Mao argued that gorillas were like fish, in that they needed the water of popular support to survive. He defined three stages of guerrilla operations. The first phase is an organization, consolidation, and preservation stage. This is the stage when the infrastructure is developed. Use is made of small scale hit and run raids for propaganda, morale, and training. In this phase, attacks are allowed only when the insurgent guerrillas have overwhelmingly superiority in fire power, good position, and surprise. The second phase is of progressive expansion. In this phase, the guerrillas moves from small scale operations to more ambitious attacks, while the hit and run tactics is still used. The guerrillas expand the base area and strengthen their control over that section of territory. Government controlled areas that previously were immune to attack now come under attack. The third phase of guerrilla operations is a decisive stage. The insurgents have grown large enough to oppose the government in conventional ways. Guerrillas type hit and run tactics are now abundant. Mao considers this phase to be like a civil war. In India, the tactics used by Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra were a classical form of guerrilla warfare. Shivaji's Andyapatra spelled out the methods of guerrilla warfare. He made excellent use of the lay of the land that was essentially hilly and mountainous, and with forest cover to harass the enemy. Given a relatively small army at his disposal and far lesser resources than the Mughal and Nizam empires, he avoided direct confrontation with the enemy forces, instead used hit and run tactics. He also made use of various forts as both means of conducting warfare and also as sanctuary at times of siege. The next one is asymmetric war and terrorism. The concept of asymmetric war was gained currency in the post Cold War period, though it is as old as war itself, because it is about a confrontation between the powerful and the weak. In the asymmetric conflict, the militarily disadvantaged power, usually a non state actor, presses its special advantages or exploits its enemy's particular weakness to achieve its objective. In other words, this type of conflict eludes the internationally accepted rules of war that entered into force with the League of Nations first and then with the United Nations. The tools or methods of asymmetrical warfare range from guerrilla tactics to propaganda and other varieties of low intensity conflicts. Since the Cold War, say, analyst examples of asymmetric war have included the struggles of the separatist Chechen against the Russian army and the Palestinian against the Israel army. India now faces a virulent form of asymmetric warfare conducted from sub-state players based in Pakistan. Next point is terrorism. Asymmetric warfare is not synonymous with the terrorism, though terrorism is sometimes used as a tactic by the weaker side in an asymmetric conflict. Terrorism has been defined as a sub-state application of violence or the threat to use violence with an intention to create panic in the society. It may appear to use guerrilla tactics, but it differs from guerrilla warfare in that terrorists do not hold on to territory like guerrillas do at some stage of their operations. The US State Department defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetuated against non combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. The word terrorism was coined during the France reign of terror in 1793 to 94, following the French Revolution. Originally, the leaders of revolution attempted to weed out traitors among the revolutionary forces. They praised terror as the best way to defend liberty. But as the revolution progressed, the word soon came to be associated with state violence by the revolutionary state itself and with the guillotine. The dawn of modern day terrorism is considered to begin with the attack on the Israeli Olympic team at Berlin in 1972. Since then, there have been airplane hijackings and bombings, assassinations like that of Rajiv Gandhi, and in perhaps one of the most daring of episodes, the use of aircraft by the terrorists in the September 11 destruction of the New York World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Today, most terrorists eschew the label, preferring to perceive themselves as irregular military forces and even as freedom fighters. The terrorists of the earlier century had strong ideological mooring. Terrorist groups traditionally contain strong quasi religious, fanatical elements that form the core of the fighters. But a distinction needs to be made between state sponsored terrorism or state terrorism and non state terrorism. Americans have for long identified Libya and Iran as cases of state sponsored terrorism, states that provide a haven for terrorist activity and sanctuary for terrorist groups would also be in this category. Today, much of terrorist activity is in the nature of ethnic separatist movements. In some cases, the ethnic groups are supported by pan religious linkages that cut across borders. The many branched Muslim Brotherhood would fall in this category, while groups like Irish Republic Army, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Kurdish extremists, the Basque Homeland and Liberty of Spain fall in the ethnic movement category. One can identify four different types of terrorism. First, there is the nationalist separatist terrorism, which is violence undertaken by those seeking to establish a separate state for their own national ethnic group. The Irish Republican Army, Basque Homeland and Liberty, the Kurdish Workers' Party, Liberation Tigers of Tamil are some of the terrorist groups that fall in this category. Then there is religious terrorism, or the use of violence by those fighting for abstract religious ideologies, seeking to further why they conceive as divinity commanded purposes, often targeting broad categories of enemies in an attempt to bring about sweeping changes. Om Shinkaro, Al Qaeda, Hizbul Hamas, etc., are some of the terrorist groups that fall under this category. Left wing terrorism is another type of terrorism. It refers to violence undertaken by those seeking to destroy capitalism and replace it with the communist or socialist regime. Some of the terrorist groups in this category are Red Army faction, German Red Brigade, Prima Linea, the Weather Underground, or Symbionese Liberation Army, etc. Closely related to this category is the right-wing terrorism practiced by those seeking to dispense with liberal democratic government. Finally, we have state-sponsored terrorism. Here, the state itself either uses terrorist tactics to achieve its objectives or harbors or supports terrorist groups by providing them with a variety of support structures. There has always been a debate about ethnic movement based terrorism that one needs to mention here. If the ethnic movement seeks the right to self determination and is using terrorist means to achieve it, would they be classified as terrorists or freedom fighters? Academic literature on the concept of right to self determination presents several theories that seek to understand the morality of succession. Just cause theories present a strong link between the right to resist tyranny and the right to self determination, and by doing so, it grounds the right to self determination in the framework of human rights. Therein comes the big question, can one man's terrorist be another's freedom fighter? The cause of Kashmir in the Indian context has been presented in this framework. Pakistan has always referred to the terrorism in Kashmir as the freedom movement of Kashmiris, with or without support of Pakistan. India has criticized it as the terrorism that has been sponsored by external forces. Perhaps an answer lies in the approach that one takes on the issue. One can look at the situation from two perspectives. One perspective is that of national integration of India. Any legitimate demand made by the people within the framework of national integration would be a legitimate demand, even if the means borders on terrorism. At another level, if terrorism is conducted in the name of abstract ideological considerations by elements that have no concern for the indigenous people and their legitimate concerns, such as a struggle cannot be a legitimate one. Much of the jihadi struggle in Kashmir is of the later variety, hence the concern about terrorism in the region. How does one protect oneself from terrorism? Long established democracies have today to face the reality that some loss of civil liberty is inevitable if one has to institute measures to protect the people. This would include curbs on free passage of people across borders, greater surveillance on suspect individuals, suspension of some civil rights in affected areas, etc. The fight against international terrorism cannot be conducted by individual nations. It has to be a coordinated effort, a sustained effort by the intelligence and law enforcement agencies across the world would be necessary to anticipate, identify, track, and destroy terrorism. In the long run, one would have to fight the mindset that is likely to generate terrorism and not simple try to contain it by force. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.